Off to you for the intro. There you go.
All right. Good morning and welcome to AI in the AM. We are sprinting through the AI marathon, and it is day 2 of our June experiment of going live most weekdays and trying to make sense of AI developments in real time and sharing the process of doing that with as much recursive self-improvement and day-to-day updates as we can manage. Good morning, Prakash. How are you?
Good morning, Nathan. It has been an exciting time overnight. Um, and as always, we will have like some back and forth here as the cameras come on. As you know, this is AGI complete problem to get all the cameras and everything working at the same time. Um,
So yesterday we literally made changes to the studio using Codex in the background while we were live and had actually our very first guest had to refresh the page to get the audio from me. Prakash has vibe coded this entire thing and it's pretty cool. I think there's going to be a lot of value and both in the utility of doing this all ourselves and being able to customize it just the way we want, and also a lot of value in just kind of showing off how we're doing this. We both took a bunch of notes yesterday from what I would say was, in some ways, a good first uh, pace mile in the sprint through the AI marathon, but in some ways it was a bit rough. So we definitely both took a lot of notes, and we've been prompting away and developing the skills to try to make sure that every day that we come back and do this, we're going to have a better, tighter format. Um, and it'll be interesting to watch this thing evolve and see if we can get to the point where we feel like we're really hitting a stride and have kind of a sustainable pace that is serving us and the audience. I think one of the things I really want to make sure for myself is that I'm not becoming a content person, in short. I really want to make sure that I am still focused on learning and understanding as much and as well as I possibly can, and uh, and building in public, and genuinely sharing the process by which we're doing this. I think is going to be a huge part of that. I was just kind of going off on my own and saying, describing a little bit of the recursive self-improvement philosophy of this project, and how, for me, and I think you have a little bit of a different angle on this, but I really want to make sure that I kind of think of this as like live reporting in a way. One of the reflections yesterday when I took my run was I really want to make sure that I'm making something that is of value to the true insiders. I think of
yeah.
somebody like friend of the show, Dean Ball, or I think Zvi reads only and doesn't really watch much stuff unless he sort of has to for review purposes. But I want to make artifacts that are hopefully of value to people that are really plugged in. And so in that sense, I think what we're doing live is sort of live reporting. But there's going to be all this sort of apparatus around the actual live engagement that we're gradually building out that hopefully will make additional artifacts that are going to, I aspire to having them be useful for people beyond those that can actually tune in live, right? I mean, I think it's going to be tough to get too many AI engineers or open AI engineers, let's say, watching 2 hours a day. So how do we sort of both engage people live, make sure that what we're doing is actually serving our own understanding and advancing the sense that we can make of everything that's going on, and cashing that out into artifacts that can be shared and hopefully have a little bit more durable value. Those are big reflections from day one for me. And certainly many prompts have flown to try to instantiate that stuff, even in just the first interval between yesterday and today.
Indeed. And as always, it's for me, the most interesting thing is that there's so much that happens every single day now, right? and it's not. It's there is a lot of value in kind of making a having a worldview today and updating it in like a week or so and seeing how much you've moved, right? Because I find that a lot of people don't update their priors. Gary Marcus being one of them.
Gary, if you're
You know,
listening, your ears might be
uh,
burning.
well, yeah, I've been, like many people, I've been blocked by him. So at some point, in the last 3 years, if you teased Gary too much, he's definitely blocked you.
It's funny that I don't
um,
think he's blocked me, and arguably I deserved it because one of the first things I ever wrote in a public way online, and it wasn't it's another example of me being not super strategic, but just in that moment and feeling like I had something to say, was when he was on the Ezra Klein podcast. Um, and we didn't have as much time yesterday as I had hoped, due to some iterative improvement that we did in real time to talk about Ezra's piece and kind of working backward and having a vision. I think he's broadly been really good on that stuff. I think the Gary Marcus episode was a bit of a miss because it was like full of all these things of AI can never do this, it can never do that. And then I just was so upset about it that I went off and wrote a, I don't even know, like 100 tweet long thread basically attacking his appearance and all, and kind of correcting the record as I saw it on everything that he said that I didn't really think was accurate in that podcast. And that was like the first thing I ever put online in a meaningful public way. And it was ended up being like much more viral than I anticipated, and it kind of turned out to be quite the dunk. But to me, he's been like quite gracious actually, and has not. And I haven't like chased him down online, for every time that he's moved the goalposts or said something that well, AI will never do something that it can already do, which I think is continue to happen probably dozens of times. Um, but for the record, he's been gracious to me, and he's I'm still not blocked.
I deserved it,
I think I honestly
yeah.
deserved it too, but I didn't get it.
So I normally refrain, but it was just too tempting a target. And all I did was I quote tweeted something he tweeted like, like several months before with a Wile E. Coyote, like, cartoon of, the coyote falling off the cliff. Yeah, he blocked me for that.
Well, we've got a bunch of news to cover again today
Yeah.
to warm up. But any thoughts or reflections on takeaways from day one, and kind of what are your top priorities for recursive self improvement right now?
Um, so I think we've spoken of the on this offline, but um, we have a pipeline of work, I guess, that starts from um, you know opening the dates, and then inviting the guests, confirming the guests, and then getting all the content, the research ready. We do a lot of research for these shows, and the research is because it's largely helped by AI. I think we're happy to share with the audience what we do. But over time, we've both refined these prompts that we have for the AI and have show notes, etc. And then we end up with the stream itself, and then we end up with post stream. We have a lot of artifacts to cover. We have to all the channels and clipping. So if you are not in the new media space, what is happening right now is that the short 30-second to 1 minute clips get something like 10 and 100 times the distribution of the longer formats. And so the clips have really become the financial engine behind most of these new media shows that you see. When people talk about new media, what they're really talking about is clippable media that is being broadcast to social channels. That is essentially what new video media is. The live stream is kind of producing the content itself in bulk, but then the refinement process and the clipping process is what converts this kind of and I look at it as primary historical research really at this point, because we are talking to people who are actually in the flow and are making history and have made history in the last 3 or 4 years, and that becomes clips that then go out. And our hope is that this whole entire cycle turnaround really speeds up a lot, which is what enables the actual interactivity of the medium. And what we found is that your words really have power on social media, right? Like if you have a take and you throw it out there, and you have a following and you are loud enough, it reaches a lot of people, and that has, I think, significant value. w- New media, these clips are basically replacing what people used to get from news sources of all kinds, and people are selecting news sources which are meaningful to them. So that is and to the extent that we can shorten that cycle time down so that we get it in the flow while things are happening instead of in retrospective, that would be ideal, I think. And that's where the recursive self-improvement part comes in, because you can recursively self-improve your own, like, environment, like the AI field itself, by feeding that information back in, and educating people, and pushing the message out. So that is really my idea of how we could. It's really recursive self-improvement, not just of the show, but of the entire field itself, that potentially we can do. Very ambitious, I know. Nathan, what do you feel?
I think that one way to think about what we're building right now is kind of a harness for ourselves, where we are, in some
Mm.
sense, little proto AGIs, but our affordances are by default kind of slow, right? Like it's hard to process all the information we need to process. It's hard to stay on top
Yeah.
of all the discussions. And so creating these skills that sort of pre-process information, present them to us in hopefully a really effective and time efficient way, set up a hopefully useful and easy to follow and informative discussion, but do that, ideally. I think at this point we got to be aiming for at least an order of magnitude speed up relative to what we could do on our own. And I think that obviously
Yeah.
the core challenge of this is going to be our own human brains, or at least I can speak for myself and say, I can have AI agents go out and do all kinds of information pre-processing. I don't necessarily learn something from that. So
Mm.
I'm going to need to hold myself accountable to making sure that I'm actually learning as much with the AIs doing more of the work than I was when I was doing more of the work myself. I think the jury's still out for me on exactly, how to accomplish that, but that's got to be the goal, because there's just this time dilation effect that,
Mhm.
as we're speeding up, we got to find some way to slow down time to make sense of all the things that we're passing by. And this harness that, it kind of allows us hopefully to drop into a an effectively pre-processed view of
Mhm.
current events is my best idea right now for how to speed up my own learning to a point where it can hopefully keep up, or at least get closer to the singularity. So with that,
W-
maybe we should cover some of today's outline. What do you got? Anything else you want to jump to it?
Yeah, we can. Maybe I can just share the overnight news. So let me just plug this in there, um, and get. Let's see. We have. Yeah, there's Blossom. All right, there we go. And let me pull it up on screen. So the major thing that happened overnight is Berkshire Hathaway has agreed. Google decided to do an $80 billion fundraise, and I will show you this very interesting graph. This is Google's stock buybacks per year. So they increase stock buybacks year by year, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 24, 25. And then this is the stock buybacks this year where they sold stock. So Google has sold stock for the first time in since they were since the IPO. They haven't sold equity before. Normally, what tech companies do is that they sell convertible bonds for a variety of reasons. Number one, founders don't want pure debt because when you go bankrupt, that debt will come back and haunt you. So they go for convertible bonds where they can convert it to stock, where interest rates are basically zero or de minimis, and that's what high growth companies typically do. Instead, Google has issued street equity. Um, and there's a bunch of comments and takes on this online. The first thing that you have to note is that Berkshire Hathaway has agreed to put in 12.5% of the 80 billion. So Berkshire is putting in 10 billion. Warren Buffett at this point has about $400 billion of cash on the balance sheet. He sold off a bunch of companies. He thinks valuations are high. He's waiting for valuations to get better, but he put in 10 billion here, which is a big chunk. He has now a 7% allocation to Google in his portfolio, and he's got some dilution protection. So he had a slightly discounted rate from the current rate. As a result, Google stock took a tiny plunge, like maybe 3% down. It's a large company, $80 billion in the context of a several $1 trillion company is not significant, but it shows the capital requirements, which are hitting even the largest players. And Ruth Porat decided to raise equity, not debt. That means that you normally need to keep this kind of debt equity ratio. So if you raise more equity now, that means you're going to raise 3 or 4 times that amount of debt later. So there's going to be a debt issuance coming. So there's going to be another couple of $100 billion of probably debt issuance coming for Google. So that's probably a quarter trillion, quarter trillion of capital Google taking in one shot. And then we also had yesterday, Anthropic filed an S1. So an S1 is a confidential registration statement with the SEC, where you tell the SEC we're thinking about going to IPO. These are our numbers, but we're not telling anyone else the numbers yet. So they filed, and then not only did they file a confidential registration, they announced it on the blog, which is like, why? And thirdly, Sam Altman was on CNBC yesterday, really talking smack about Anthropic. He's like, I don't know why. I don't know why they have to say all these bad things. Like everyone's going to lose their jobs like 6 months ago, and now they're not talking about it. Um, in essence, what we're having right now is this race for capital. There's a sense in the market that capital is scarce or will become scarce. And when capital becomes scarce, the price of capital will go up. And I think the Google issuance is a sign that the price of capital is starting to go up, and that they're issuing the equity in order that they may issue debt at a lower price. And so this is something we kind of seem to be having higher inflation rates, but also higher returns on stocks. And that's great that you have a high return on stocks, but if you're a working person on the street and you are not really invested in stocks directly, maybe you have a pension fund or whatever, but you're not directly invested, you're watching gas prices go up and inflation go up, you're not getting the benefit of this. So that's one thing to note. It's very interesting to see Berkshire in there. If he's in there for 10, he's probably going to be in there for another 100 later on. So I think you might see Berkshire as one of the primary funders of this infra at this point. Um, One other thing, margin loan balances. So margin loan balances, when people buy stock, you can take a loan from a brokerage. And when you take a loan from a brokerage, you have a margin loan, and that makes your returns better because someone's lent you the money to buy stock. And but if stocks go down, you have a margin call, you have to repay the money. And this is there's no like limitation of liability here. You can go absolutely bankrupt if you can't cover. So margin loan stats are at all-time highs at retail brokerage. It's more than $100 billion of margin loans just in one brokerage, which means across the market you have trillions of dollars. And finally, AI too seems to be breaking up. So AI two, they had the, I think, Olmo models that they put out. They were American, very strongly open source, group, and they disclosed a lot of their secrets while they were training these models. They disclosed everything. One of the key questions is they were very well regarded technically, and but they were not making a lot of money. And so one of the questions has always been, can they keep their talent? And it seems like Nathan Lambert, who was one of the leaders there, is leaving. And I saw another post from someone else who's also leaving there. So that is, one more thing to note. Another U.S. open source champion seems to be breaking apart. So back to you, Nathan. What comments on the overnight news?
Well, definitely the Anthropic preparation, not confidential filing stands out. Some of the interesting commentary that I've seen around that, first of all, is like, okay, what's the valuation going to be? Excuse me. One of the more interesting posts was basically saying at $1 trillion, it's obviously a steal. And so it might be significantly more than that. I'd be interested to hear what you think uh, the opening and fair price for Anthropic might be. And obviously that's going to be driven by uh, sentiment, as much as fundamentals. Fundamentals are strong, but the sentiment might be even stronger. And then at the same time, we have Bernie Sanders, who is taking a lot of positions on AI, some of them arguably contradictory, has put forward this idea that there should be some national equity stake
Mm,
in the biggest tech companies. And I would say, like, I'm very sympathetic to that idea on some level. I think there's, a lot of friend of the show, Dean Ball, has been critiquing him repeatedly for, I think, the contradictory aspects of his portfolio of positions, which is like, I want to have an equity, share for the public, but also we can't have any more data centers. And that doesn't seem to fit together super coherently. Maybe you can make sense of it. But I am pretty sympathetic to the idea that, like, yeah, I mean, American wealth is estimated at something like 150, $165 trillion across all the major asset classes. That's basically 5 times, a little more than 5 times GDP. And
mhm,
you look at just the market cap of the 5 or 10 biggest companies, and you're starting to get a not insignificant share of national wealth is bound up in the 5 to 10 top companies. I mean, literally just the top three of Nvidia, Apple, Google gets you to about 15. Like, those three companies are worth almost
mhm,
10% of America's entire national wealth. And certainly the AGI pilled among us think that that might continue even more dramatically into the not too distant future, right? If all of a sudden you add Anthropic to that at a few trillion, and OpenAI to that at a few trillion, and it's no longer crazy for people to speculate that Anthropic could be a $10 trillion company in a few years. Um, then yeah, it's a little crazy to have that much wealth bound up in so few hands. So I'm pretty sympathetic to the Bernie argument that there should be some sort of share.
mhm,
Um, I'm also very sympathetic to Vitalik Buterin, who said, "Man, this sucks. Like, the U.S. population is only 4% of the global population. These companies were started with a benefit all humanity,
mhm,
and now they're like going to IPO, and there's like, and they're going to give away some through the foundation or whatever." Um, and Bernie's got this idea that we should have a national wealth fund, which could be good. But what about the other 96%?
mhm, mhm,
I
mhm,
think that discourse is going to be something really interesting to watch, and it's
mhm,
also going to be. I mean, I'm throwing a lot of questions at you at once here, but another news item that came across yesterday was OpenAI now going available on AWS.
mhm,
So this continues the trend of just everybody being in bed with everybody, everybody's kind of fates being tied
mhm,
in one way or another, balance sheet or rev shares and all of it. Right? It seems like we've sort of created kind of backed into creating, in a way, like one big AI megacorp where
Hmm.
a failure of any one of them seems like it would have like massive contagion, or at least there would be like significant
Hmm.
risk of that at this point.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem super likely to me. Like I think basically the demand is going to be there, barring some external
Hmm.
shock. Um, but
Hmm.
external shocks could happen, or I could be surprised. And this whole kind of probably already, once you count all the companies that are deeply intertwined in all these different ways, you have something that's maybe a $30 trillion megacorp that is almost for sure too big to fail, right? So I think that that's the
Hmm.
other thing that makes me very sympathetic to the Bernie argument is like whether or not the government recognizes it, I think at this point they are the financier of the AI
Hmm.
megacorp of last resort. Because
Hmm.
if one day OpenAI can't make their payments for whatever reason, there's going to be some sort of step in bailout moment where it's like, yeah, we're not going to let everybody default. We're not going to let this contagion go that crazy. So yeah, we'll come in and patch it up somehow, monetize whatever. You understand those machinations better than I do.
Yeah.
But if we are on the hook for that as the public, then I do think we also should probably have some better claim on the upside
Hmm.
than a Larry Summers flavored board that is going to give out some grants. So what do you think? How can we shape? I guess my first question would be: are you at all sympathetic, and how would you shape the Bernie proposal to try to make it something that would actually be a winner?
So, Bernie's a socialist, right? Uh, and uh, one of the things that they do is they try and pull wool over your eyes a little bit. And the fact of the matter is, I think U.S. corporate tax rates are like what 20% or something. Um, I will trade, like I will buy Anthropic stock, and I will trade like 20% of Anthropic stock for the government's 20% right of 20% of the taxes, and I would do better on the 20% of the government's 20% take on the taxes than he does on his 20% stock, right? The fact of the matter is taxes are super equity. They are non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. You have, and you have to. It's better than preferred equity because preferred equity you have a dividend that you have to pay out. Normal equity you don't. So Anthropic can be there and say like, look, I'm not going to pay out any dividends. That's up to me, to my equity holders. They can do that. If you have taxes, they can't do that. They have to pay the taxes. You have no choice, right? And the taxes come out. So the fact of the matter is, when you look at like the cash flow that you get from equity and the cash flow that you get from taxes, the cash flow that you get from taxes is more certain, and it's non-dischargeable in bankruptcy, and there's a lot fewer ways that you can play games around it with it, and the board and the management don't have control of whether they want to pay it or not. Unlike shares, the board and the management have decisions whether they want to pay out dividends. They can choose not to pay out dividends. They can choose not to buy back stock. They can choose to reward themselves, right? So shares are not that powerful as taxes are. Taxes are really powerful. And so what Bernie is saying is, you could just say like we'll just increase corporate taxes. You could say, hey, we will, structure a ladder of taxes so that if you're making windfalls, we will have higher taxes on you. All of these are things that you could say. Instead, he's doing this 50% because the 50% is in addition to the taxes. That's the magic trick. The magic trick is not that he wants a stake because the government already has a stake through taxes. The magic trick is that he wants more than what he has currently. And this is the illusion that all of the Dem socialist proposals all have. They are all about addition. This is the same reason the UBI proposal has not worked out well, because the original libertarian UBI proposal was a replacement of current welfare with a UBI so that you didn't have to means test for welfare, because the means testing, like bureaucracy, is very large and more expensive than some of the welfare that you actually give out. Uh, but that would involve non-additional dollars. So it's like, I'm going to do UBI and replace your food stamps with UBI. All of the people who are getting food stamps or are eligible right now would get no new dollars. All of the new dollars would go to people who are not eligible for food stamps, who don't need them anyway, right? So this is why the U has never worked out, because the people who are supporting the people who need this extra money, they want additional dollars. They don't want political bureaucratic replacement of the existing dollars with the new structure. No new additional dollars. They don't want that. Same thing Bernie's doing. Bernie doesn't want the replacement of the existing. He wants additional dollars, and that's the key thing. The key thing is that he wants an additional stake, right? And he doesn't want to do it through the normal path, because the normal path you'd have to go through Congress. So instead, you're doing this massaging and trying to get shares, and the shares would then be run by a bureaucracy. Congress would not, because who has the power to allocate taxes? Congress. He doesn't want to go through Congress. He wants to set up a bureaucracy, like a sovereign wealth fund that both politicians on both sides are doing this, right? It's a slush fund that you can then appoint people who are your friends into positions in those firms, and they can get paid, and you can direct the flows of those funds without Congress, right? Congress has the power of the purse. Use Congress, right? Like this is what I find annoying, because the US has this marvelous institutional structure, like marvelous, right? And both parties basically don't want to use this institutional structure, and Congress has not, doesn't want to use its power, doesn't want to use its power of taxes or passing laws or legislation. Kind of backs away and like, hey, we won't do anything permanent, and we'll let the executive kind of run circles around us. Like, it's very annoying for me. It's very, very annoying.
Well, let me try to
So
challenge you on that one more time, because
yeah,
I think, and it'll be an interesting segue perhaps into our first guest, which is going to be
yeah,
two forward deployed engineers from OpenAI who are creating amazing things as always, and potentially changing a lot of organizations, and potentially we'll see what they are willing to recognize the impacts might be in terms of employment. But I think on the taxes front, it's like, well, wait a second. These companies probably aren't going to turn that much of a profit. They're going to do the Amazon strategy, where they're going to show very little profit for the foreseeable future. They're going to be able to reinvest in data centers, in robotics. They're already talking about Dyson spheres, right? They're going to try to put data centers in space. And so the capex is endless on this. And it's not hard for me to imagine a situation where in, whatever, 5, 10 years time, who cares exactly how long it takes, you have an AI megacorp that is sort of, whether explicitly merged or just, intertwined enough, 10 other megacorps collectively worth, 50% or more of US national wealth.
yeah,
And yet no profits were actually made. And so no taxes were actually paid.
yeah.
Meanwhile, the companies sort of do what the platform owners have done in their personal lives broadly, which is like not pay a lot of taxes,
Mm-hmm,
they continue to hold the equity, borrow
mm-hmm,
against the equity,
mm-hmm,
and basically live a low tax lifestyle. So I am still sympathetic to Bernie on the level that, and I think you're very kind to the U.S. On paper, I think we've got, yes, an excellent institutional structure. As it's actually playing out in practice, it's not going so great, right? I mean, I think that's pretty consensus opinion at this point. So I would frame, if I want to be at least somewhat charitable to Bernie, I would say this is the pro growth Bernie who is not trying to, and of course he's got the anti-data center side, which is the
Yeah.
which makes it a little more hard to square, but leave that aside for a second. Just this proposal of share of equity, like that's the pro growth Bernie that says, well, let's align our public interest with these private companies. Then, exactly how that gets kind of paid out or, turned liquid. Do we all start, probably the government starts borrowing against its shares, I suppose, of these companies and doling out benefits that way. But in some ways, I don't know, that feels to me like you could say it's more. What I like about it is it seems to align the public's interest to where this technology is all going, which presumably is, you know, to the moon, like literally, in as much as we're going to have data centers in space.
Um, so, well, you know, the cash has to go somewhere, right? If when Amazon spends money, it's not as though the cash like disappears, right? The cash ends up being spent on other things, and those other people end up spending on other things, right? And the government at the end of the day doesn't need to take the tax dollars from Amazon. It can take it from, the Amazon employee, right? So there's this question of like tax incidents. Like the tax incidents may not be incident on Amazon, but it gets the dollar circulating in the economy, and the government has a take on sales taxes, on income taxes. And Bernie's preference is that all of the money is spent on employees anyway, and that's where the income tax hits, right? So you know why would you care about whether the company makes corporate income and pays taxes on it, when all of the money is gets allocated to other entities which end up paying taxes anyway, right?
Well, I
And
guess that, yeah. So this is, maybe we have to switch gears a little bit to our first guest, but I do think how many employees? I mean, Amazon has 1 million employees or
yeah,
more, right?
yeah,
OpenAI, as we're going to hear, is hiring forward deployed engineers,
yeah.
but I don't think we're going to see 1 million forward deployed engineers. So it still leaves this question of like, what would you want to tax? Like, is it a token tax? Is it a data center tax? Is it a replacement tax of some kind? If our tax bot, does the work of large numbers of accountants. I don't have an answer to that, but it doesn't seem like we can just naively say that, oh, well, it'll come in payroll taxes, because I don't know how much payroll is going to scale with the economic activity that is powered by AI. And maybe with that, I should invite you
Yeah.
to welcome our first guests today to our
Yeah.
broadcast.
So our first guests today are John Wesige and Arthur Fernandez Araujo. They are both OpenAI forward deployed engineers, and they have been working on tax AI. And they've been working with the OpenAI team on tax AI, and also with Thrive and Crete. And what they've been doing over the last 6 months have been, as we went into tax season in April, they have created tax AI that has managed to process I think 7,000 or so claims over the last 6 months, and they've seen a market improvement in how many cases the AI that they've built can handle. It's also interesting, I think, because Thrive has been working on a strategy which many people in the space are trying to deploy, which is what we call the roll up of service firms. And the roll up of service firms idea is that AI can now take on these service type jobs like accounting, etc. But currently, all of these service firms are fragmented into thousands of firms worldwide, each one with several partners and staff doing stuff. And now, for the first time, you can maybe merge all of these into larger firms. And instead of selling software subscriptions, you can sell the service itself to other companies and to other people. So, without further ado, John, Arthur, welcome to AIAM.
Hey Prakash, hey Nathan, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Let me just ask you, most people hear tax AI agent and they assume the hard part is making the model smart enough to read tax documents. But in your tax AI post, it's almost the opposite. The system got better because the product was engineered so accountant creation corrections became evidence. The numbers you had were 7,000 returns processed, one third of prep time saved, throughput up about 50%. And within 6 weeks, the share of scored returns reaching at least 75% field completion moved from about a quarter to 86%. So the question became not just can AI prepare a tax return, um, can a production workflow teach an agent what to improve without engineers hand debugging every failure? So, how did you guys do that?
I think a good point, I think, to clarify before we dive into that is what is self-improving here. So we're not really talking about self-improving the model itself, but it's mostly the harness around it. And this workflow in particular, I think you got to some of it in your initial comments, Prakash. I think is a good proving ground for this, where you have very messy inputs, but also a lot of basically practitioner judgment that is also part of this workflow, review workflows. But you have a very good way to measure the outcomes. But what is improving is essentially the harness around what the model is basically leveraging in order to produce the preparation, the extractions. Um,
When you say harness, are you referring to kind of like every time you come to an edge case, the humans kind of help the model to like figure out the edge case, and then that becomes part of like a memory of heuristics that you then apply the next time you come across the edge case? Is that what's happening?
yeah, so when I talk about the harnesses, we leverage Codex to do a lot of the work here. But there is basically the set of instructions, skills, the data that you use it, and the specific way that you use this. This is part of the or tax AI agent. But then when you encounter these edge cases, what we document in the blog post is exactly how you make sure as like a good coworker that if you provide a correction, the next time it can be effective at basically not making the same mistake. So it's around changing the structure of what Codex uses, the skills, the durable artifacts, so it cannot make that mistake in the future.
So when you say skills, is it literally like the skills that other people are making for Codex right now? You use a skill creator and you say like, hey, this is a 1040 form, and this is what I want you to do with it. And as you work through it, you're like, okay, this happened, like fix it for me, and then it documents like it in the skill. Is that what's happening?
Yeah, so it's the same skills that you and I know from using classic codecs. Well, what's interesting here is that so there are these skills that are available, and over time, what we sometimes notice is that the models got better as well. And so when what used to be a skill maybe 2 or 3 months ago, today is potentially we should deprecate it because the model is able to do what is in the skill by itself. And so this is also something that's very interesting that we observe is that the skills themselves they change, and like part of the self-improving loop is also letting the harness the ability to propose new skills potentially to also update all the content that's available for the next loops afterwards.
I think that's a
So
really interesting. My friend Daniel Miesler, who created personal AI infrastructure, as far as I know, coined the term bitter lesson engineering, which, and I also think Logan Kilpatrick recently spoke to it. He said, as so many have said, the model eats the harness. So what you're setting up here is basically a sort of tick-tock kind of back and forth where with a new model, there's this opportunity for it to clear out all of these heuristics that it accumulated previously, because now the model might just be able to do those things. And so we want to kind of clean house, tidy up, get rid of all these potentially distracting things and let the model excel where it excels. But then you'll probably start to accumulate another layer of heuristics, and that process works in tandem with model upgrades so that we hill climb all the way to full tax automation. And you guys have made a lot of progress. I mean, could you maybe, I think the numbers are of course interesting. Like at the beginning, not that many of the returns were completed accurately. Now, like a majority of them are mostly accurate. Are we going to see what is the sort of plateau or end state? Are we going to have like a full self-driving sort of thing where we find that the edge cases and the long tail are just like problematic for years to come? Do you think that it is in fact like, hey, there's actual law around this, so in a reasonably finite period of time, we can actually like knock the whole thing out? What's your expectation for like what the future of this curve is going to look like?
So the thing that we actually observe in practice is that with the new models getting better, the new models getting better, and the harness around it that we create that is also better, is that we are able to tackle like more complex forms. So, for example, you would say that a W2 is potentially is actually quite simple. But then when you look at a Schedule E or a Schedule C, like Schedule E, such as like rental properties, then it's way more complex because you have data that's coming in from different sources. It can be client notes, it can be Excels, it can be PDFs as well. And so the more we advance, the more we're able to tackle things. But kind of like taking a step back here, one thing that is really important is to have a good ability to measure how good you're doing. And this also ties back to your previous point on like, how do you know when you have a new model, if it's better or not? And I think like partly when you generate, when you create any AI related software, is that having a strong way of having evals that measure exactly how you're doing and how your metrics are doing, and to kind of backtrack in time and see, okay, if I had run the evals at that time with that knowledge, what would it get with the new harness that I have? And in our case, this allows us to have some very strong conviction that what we are doing was actually better and was actually growing.
How do you get feedback from users? I think, one of the ways we're conceiving of this show, which we're doing live, we're spending a lot of hours in live, right? So it's got to be, in a way, its own experiment in recursive self-improvement. And one thing I realize I don't have a great crystallization of yet is, okay, we do, a couple hours live. We've got all the, this studio that we're in is vibe coded. There's lots of opportunity for improvements everywhere. And then I just kind of do a brain dump into a doc and, put that in as a prompt. I think one of the key insights or practices that you've developed probably is, how do I most effectively get the corrections in a high context way from users? I'd love to understand, what your best practices are there, so I can go point my agent at the transcript of this podcast and have it apply them for me.
I think for the type of problem that we try to solve, I think what was interesting there is we didn't try. Both John and I, we come from like software engineering background, and the way that you basically gather feedback, sometimes you would go to the field, interview people. You get also like tickets with opaque feature requests and things like this, and then your engineering team is your job to essentially like distill that, figure out how that ties into the product roadmap, and iterate. I think what was interesting here about this piece is how we try and flip the book and try to drive the AI transformation from the inside out instead of the outside in. So trying to give the experts that are using the product every day the tools that integrate very seamlessly with how they're using the product. So every time they basically took an action, like a correction, we captured that information and we had the whole user journey in a way that, like, if we noticed that essentially we made a mistake in that specific part of the product which is related to the preparation, how can we essentially leverage the entire user journey to improve the product. In a way, it's kind of like, it's similar to maybe watching a video of the user using your product, but you're not capturing the whole video, which requires a lot of human attention, and human attention is a very scarce resource. So the way that we try to really distill this is by getting the highest signal parts, the highest signal traces from what the users were doing and the product as changes. So if you think about this in terms of like a spectrum, we either have just like what we produced and what was the truth, so you don't have anything that happened in the middle, or you have, for example, something that is like super detailed, like an application trace, and you have the whole application trace, which is maybe too detailed, and it's like harder to make like semantic meaning out of it. So this is also something that recently we published a piece in the OpenAI cookbook around macro evals. And I think what we do in this piece is essentially this idea of like a macro eval. You don't have just the ground truth and the inputs. You have some very targeted things in between that are relevant for the problem.
You know, one of the things that it strikes me is that there's always this balance between, the model should be good enough to do everything, the generality of the model, and the kind of fine-tuning harness engineering that you do for the task, right? So to what extent do you see kind of like the harnesses that you've built, their capabilities being subsumed by the next generation of the model? Do you see that where you start off building a harness and then it works well, but you also tell the team that is working on post-training that, hey, this is what works well, this is what doesn't work well? And do you see some of the pieces of the harness that you build kind of get absorbed by the next generation of the model? Do they end up using it for training and then it becomes part of the next generation of the model?
Yeah, so yeah, this is a very good point, and this is something which we definitely see. So if we look at what we had a few months ago compared to now, like the harness and the software end has definitely changed. So from our end, what we try to do is to make sure that you don't kind of go against the model capabilities. So you try to, from what I've seen, is the best, like the success happens when you're able to develop the software and the harness in such a way that it goes along the model being great. And so sometimes it means, for example, deprecating skills, or changing some, like making such that the codes of the models are able to handle some more complex workflows. But then it also means bringing that feedback and our learnings back to the team internally. And so definitely what we do is we try to observe where the model lacks, be it both in specific topics or concept, or on the harness itself. It could be, for example, bad at some point at getting a specific type of information. And so if we observe this, then you bring this back, and ideally through evals. And so this allows the models to become better at this point.
Yeah. So I imagine the humans that you work with, the teams that you work with, they have a lot of extra time now. That now that 70% is being handled by the tax AI itself, they have more time. Like, what are they doing with that more time? How have they ended up allocating the time that has gotten freed up?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question to talk a bit more about how this was deployed. So we piloted with a few firms on the Crit portfolio. That also enabled us to like measure exactly how that affected the firms that the software was piloted in. And I think preparation was a very good place to start, because it's definitely a high friction task for the practitioners, where if you imagine, this industry is very seasonal as well. So in the weeks before the tax season end, you can imagine like how much work the folks have to do. And I think what really unlocks here is like a very differentiated kind of service that they can provide to their clients, certain things that they couldn't do before. in terms of like the relationship with their clients, or even being able to take up more work near the tax season end, where they would need in the past they would not be able to. So I think it really changes basically. It really reshapes their tasks, like especially around like the periods where they have to do quite a lot of work. I think we also document this in the post, like for some of the really hard returns, that would be something that would take them 8 hours sometimes, of basically going through like a lot of documents, sometimes having to reconcile information from different documents and until like the number that they will put into the tax engine. So I think it really reshapes their job in a way that is more positive to them. They can focus on more strategic things.
How far do you? I feel like it's funny. Tax is one of the examples. I kind of think about the world as being on sort of a spectrum from, on the one extreme, things that I would love to have lots more of if they became cheaper. And I sometimes think of like massages being a great example of that, right? If a massage was 100 times cheaper, I'd probably get a lot more of them. And then on the other end, I often actually use tax as an example of something that, even if it were a lot cheaper, I probably wouldn't buy that much more than I'm buying today. So because I'm just like, I want to get it done. I want to be think about something else, right? Like, this is not a place where I want to spend a lot of my time. So I'm very enthusiastic about having an AI that can do my taxes for me at 1% of what it used to cost. But when you talk about the professionals or the businesses being able to serve more customers, it strikes me that there's like that they are taking share from competitors rather than like really expanding the market. I guess there's some like retail margin perhaps, or, some small business owners that are currently doing it themselves that, could get it done professionally as it becomes more accessible. But that seems sort of like a one-time market growth where we'll shift from like some people being not served to being served. And I guess I'm wondering, like, honestly, that feels pretty inescapable. I just can't imagine there's that many more people that are like, I really want a deep relationship with my tax professional, and if only they had the time to spend with me, then we could really be close, indefinitely into the future. How do the people that are actually doing this feel about it? There was the story, of course, from Meta of like Zuckerberg having the, all the keystrokes logged so that they can, train their AIs on it. It seemed like the public reaction to that was broadly very negative. People don't like to be put in the position of training their AI replacements. And yet this is like also clearly competitively where the market is going. So what has the social reaction been from the tax professionals that you guys are working closely with? For me, that's maybe the most interesting part of your experience.
Yeah. So I think like the main reaction that we observed throughout the months, and especially in the weeks coming to the end of tax preparation, is that as Arthur mentioned, we have seen, like, for example, we had one senior accountant that for like last year, I think spends around 180 hours of preparation, and this year it shifted to around 15. And so like this gap is pretty huge, right? And they see it. And the way it works is I think like from the feedback we receive is that it's very positive because they are able to focus on more of the high end, like the high spectrum of the task where they are able to bring more value, and the fact that they don't see the number of like the size of the business that they are able to tackle reduce, and instead it actually grows. I think this is pretty exciting for them. And I would also say that the tasks that are automated right now would be, for example, opening, an Excel, going to look into a specific sheet, going to find the right cells that you need to sum up, compare it to an image that you see on the side and see if that actually matches up, and also look at a PDF and cross-reference if the data makes sense, right? And so there is like a high volume of work where the human value is, can be shifted towards more, okay, thinking about where should this actually be submitted? Should this be into that tax submission field, or should it be in that one? And so there is some optimization, which I think which the tax experts would want to do if they had more time and actually are not able to. And so from their point of view, I think it's more, okay, we are able to spend that time there, and this is actually way more interesting for us, but also for and especially for the customers.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense that the quality of life of the tax preparer taking advantage of all these tools goes up dramatically. Do you think that they are like, what is their vision of the future of the industry? Do you think, because my vision is, and maybe they see it the same, maybe they see it differently, but my vision is like, we have 10% as many tax professionals, the market is bigger, everybody gets what they need for cheap, and it's a win for everybody who's party to the transactions. It obviously raises a big question that, folks like Bernie Sanders are taking an interest in around what happens to the other 90% of the tax professionals we used to have. But maybe they see it differently. I mean, do the actual tax professionals see that shift in a similar way, or what do you think their expectation is for tax in 2030?
I think it's hard for us to put words into their mouth. I think what we can probably say is from I echo what John communicated in terms of mostly around the workflow that we've automated. We mostly got positive sentiment out of it. But in terms of like how Thrive Holdings is thinking about these industries, in general, their thesis is they acquire, they own, they also operate businesses that benefit from long-term technological driven transformation. But I think to address your question, I think it's a much better spot to be in when the transformation is driven from the inside out rather than the outside in. So I think in the past, a lot of technological transformations, they definitely happen. Like if you think about the smartphone, the internet, all of these revolutions, like I think they happen from the outside in across society. But I feel that the holdings business is a bit differentiated because they're thinking about driving this transformation from the inside out, and in terms of how the companies that they hold in their portfolio operate. So I think that is probably the right model to think about, not just deploying AI, but like more meaningful integrating with the jobs on the businesses that they operate. It's hard for me to take a broader look around like the whole economic shifts that might happen in the next few years. I think it's hard for everybody to make like a good prediction around the future here. But I think in general, this is a very differentiated kind of engagement as well. For us as engineers, it also enabled us to like even build out tax AI in the first place, because we're not a vendor here trying to prove product market fit or anything like this. We can really deploy something from day one, working closely with these folks. But I think it's to your point that you made before around the curves and the charts that we produce. I don't think we ever achieve 100% for some of the more complicated returns. I think there's always going to be a lot of human judgment involved, especially on some of the more complicated parts of like the tax returns.
So one question I had about that is that I think obviously your professionals have and the firms themselves have liability to the customers, right? So they are supposed to act in good faith and do the work that they promised, et cetera, et cetera. Is there this sense that the professionals are really providing kind of like a liability cover while most of the work is being done by the AI? Is that a way to view kind of like they have like the last touch kind of like sign off, but most of the work is being done by the AI and the liability though falls with them?
Yeah, so I think in practice, what we are seeing, like that would be, I think, a definitely fair comment to make. In practice, what we see is that those teams are very on board with them, with us, and like that's something which is actually very interesting and which Thrive does in a great way. And I think like taking a step back, the like for example OpenAI FDE model has a bit of this, like going very close to the practitioners and users. And so here, in that case, what we saw is that they feel like they are on board with us and they are co-developing. They are not actually building a platform, but like their feedback is taken on a daily basis, and the people at Thrive go often on site with the people, or spending time with them. And so it's really about us, and so there is not a shift of, okay, like our mission is, like we spend less time doing this because the AI is doing it. It's more, how can you make your job more efficient? And so, like the question of reducing the time that they spend is like everyone stays aligned, I would say, in this model. And so I've, like, because motivation usually go higher up. Like our feeling is more that people feel like they are taken on the mission, and since they are the one doing the actual work, it's that part is very interesting, and so they feel like they are empowered, and so I would say they are even more motivated after this than before.
Well, so just in a practical sense, I know a lot of people are trying this forward deployed engineer kind of model. Several firms, General Catalyst, one of them is trying. General Catalyst has bought a hospital, and they decided to dive right in. 18% of the U.S. economy is in medical and healthcare services. They bought a hospital. They're trying to forward deploy engineers in there to implement AI. Like, what are the lessons that you've learned, like deploying, and like what kind of advice would you give? Like, what is this process? What, like, in your mind, after I'm sure all of the challenges that you faced in the last 6 months, what is the ideal kind of like forward deployment strategy that a company should be using?
Yeah, so I think forward deployed engineering has definitely been a term more present in the past few months, and I think it might mean different things in different contexts. I think for OpenAI, forward deployed engineering means bridging the gap between frontier and AI and business impact. But we also take a differentiated step that we're not just applying existing tools from the playbook of applied engineering. We usually work on some of the hardest problems and the hundreds of millions, $1 billion problems that require novel approaches, and also bridging the gap with research and product internally. So we need to move the needle so the next version of the model can maybe be better at the tasks on the specific problems that we're facing, aligning with product strategy. So we basically operate in this very messy environment where across product research and the actual business use case. I think that's also true in other cases in terms of basically operating across different types of environments. And in general, it's a very humbling experience because you come into this problem not being the domain expert. As an anecdote, John and I are not even based in the US, so we don't even file US taxes. So we need to rely very heavily on the experts. And I think it's very important essentially to figure out the best mechanism to collaborate with the domain experts. And whatever you deploy, it needs to be something that really invests deeply with their workflow. And I think the approach that we've seen fail in the past is essentially building something which has a very high error rate, trying to tackle the problem as a whole. So we talk a lot about this in the article, which I think is also the right way to do forward deployed engineering in other places, which is always thinking about iterative approach. So taking a slice that you can measure well and that has a meaningful impact to your users, and then seeing how you can expand the perimeter and bringing them to the journey. I think that's that's the general advice.
Indeed. And with that, thank you guys, for joining us on AIM. This has been one of the most interesting, I think, segments that we've done so far, because I think this is a topic that everyone is very interested in, and so it's very enlightening to hear exactly how you're doing in the trenches.
Great.
It was a
Thanks for
Great to
pleasure.
meet you
joining us.
both. Thanks,
Thank you.
guys.
Bye.
Cheers. So,
Yeah, fascinating stuff. It's what do you make of the? Is there any other vision other than a 90% smaller headcount in the tax base? It doesn't seem like it.
there are, what I always say is that there are visions, but you might not like what those visions are.
Yeah. Well, we lost you for a second, it looks like, but I feel like, you mentioned earlier, Prakash, if you can hear me, that Sam Altman was on CNBC critiquing Anthropic for being too doomy about jobs or whatever. But honestly, it just feels more honest to me. I don't really know what to make. I mean, I think that, those two were careful. John and Arthur were careful to, just try to walk a fine line, I think. 'Cause I wouldn't say that they were dishonest. Saying like it's hard for us to, say what other people believe is certainly fair enough, and probably like result of good media training. But at the Sam Altman level, I don't really see how they could be seeing this as anything other than, in the end, just a massive restructuring of the industry where there's just a lot less payroll at the end of it than there was at the beginning. It's I don't know. It's hard for me to tell a different story. One thing I do think is pretty interesting strategically is this is the strategy also is like, you could compete directly, right? You could say, what do we need? And this, I think, like Google went through this, this phase, right? Where they were like, we're Google, we can do anything. We don't need to go partner with, peasants who work in traditional businesses. We're just going to fly right in over the top and have the technology solve, and it'll be amazing. And that'll be that. And I do think honestly that like AIs can get there and will get there for a lot of these problems. But this may be the fastest path to get there because it gets you a lot more access to the nitty-gritty data, and now you're like aligned with at least a part of the industry, so you can kind of climb these hills together to the point where at some point the model probably can just do most retail and and at least like relatively uncomplicated business tax. And then there will be this really interesting moment of, do they disintermediate, or do they, for political economy reasons, decide we'll kind of stay in the background? Do you see a open AI tax product that is directly marketed, or do they continue to just kind of say, well, we're just an enabler of these other super successful firms? I sort of suspect that latter path may be one that they choose to take simply because they don't want to own all the headlines and consequences of like what they could do if they just directly went to market, standalone and competed head to head. Even though I do think in the end they could probably win that.
So what struck me was they were very aware that the next generation of model was going to absorb parts of the harness. And this is one thing that I've remarked on before, that the model firms basically kill their eat their largest token users in the next generation. So you had the first generation chat, GPT-3, the largest users were Jasper, these marketing copy firms, and the next generation of the model, ChatGPT, devoured that set. And at one point, Sam Altman had to fly to Texas and sit down with the CEO of Jasper after ChatGPT released, and the CEO was like, "You said you weren't going to compete with us," and Sam was like, "Yeah, we're not charging for ChatGPT. It's a research release. You guys still have the paid product. We're not charging anything. It's a research. It's for free. It's a research release." Right. And
great comfort, I'm sure, was found in those remarks.
I think his name is Higginmoser or something. The guy had raised like 100 mil. Jasper was worth about $1 billion, and he posted like a couple of weeks later on Twitter, like, I'm looking for acquisitions, because now that the core business was done, like they had to find something else because the core business was going to die, and we don't hear about Jasper anymore, right? And I think we're this kind of continuous Sherlocking will continue to happen, and the next round of Sherlocking is going to be the service firms. And some of the service firms have walked into it. So Harvey, for example, is definitely like a forward deployed engineering like organization for gathering data on law firms, and that's going to end up getting absorbed by OpenAI. It's very, very clear. And so you can now see like the next layer of service firms. The accounting firms were so uncompetitive and have such high moats that Thrive was like, all right, I'm going to buy them. I'm going to buy all of them. And then once we buy all of them, then we can actually deploy what we need to. Right. So that is a strategy. A general intelligence should be able to do taxes, should be able to drive a car. I think one of the things that, Elon is scared about is that, and Sam kind of like poisoned the well for Elon. Sam was like, in someday, like, we should be able to drive a car too. Like, it's not like that difficult. Right. So I think that this whole, the chase for generality, puts all of these firms in competition with their biggest users. And so every generation, every 18 months, the next level of capabilities like absorbs. And so the scary thing for me right now is that what you see these guys doing on the forward deployed edge in 18 months will be part of the core model. Right? And I think that is something that people have everyone has like a lot of difficulty like absorbing that fact. They're like, they kind of push away. Everyone has this like linear curve. Like, no one wants to deal with this exponential curve. No one wants to believe that, hey, what we're doing today at the frontier is going to be absorbed in 18 months. No one wants to think about that. So
yeah. Well, that's a perfect transition to a little segment of field notes and a little research speed run from my visit to San Francisco a couple of weeks ago now to go to this event called Recursive, because that event was certainly populated by people who have taken the various bitter lessons to heart, including the one that the models are going to eat all their scaffolding and gradually and perhaps very quickly or even suddenly at some point lock into recursive self-improvement loops that could really change everything. So yeah, I guess for starters, I'll just see how fast I can speedrun this. I'm not known for brevity. Feel free to interrupt me if you want to poke at anything with questions. What I was going to try to do is describe my experience there in a few minutes, and then just highlight some of the key papers that got talked about there a lot, because I do think those are things that people should be paying attention to if they want to, move a little closer to the kind of, core of the AI insider bubble. So this event was called Recursive. It was premised on the idea that recursive self-improvement seems to be coming pretty soon. It is increasingly the explicit plan of at least Anthropic and OpenAI and Google DeepMind to some extent, although they kind of waffle on it a little bit more. Whereas, OpenAI has publicly put forward timelines of later this year for an ML research intern and early 2028 for the full AI R&D researcher that they hope will perform on the level of their human researchers. So the kind of basic theory of change there is a pretty obvious one, but worth stating that today they may have 1,000 or a couple thousand people that they would really consider to be top-notch ML researchers. If they can get that same level of performance from models on chips, then they're only limited by the amount of compute that they can throw at it. And obviously they're building out a lot of compute. So presumably they could throw 1 million human researcher equivalents at problems. And they also, by the way, you may have noted, they run faster and they run 24/7. So the hope is that this will allow them to move much faster than they have moved, and kind of pull away from the competition. I would say most people at that event thought that that was very credible. There was not too much debate around like, will this level off? Now, obviously, there's some selection effect there, but you could just go to the whole event was under Chatham House rules, so I will
Mhm.
respect that and not attribute specific statements
Mhm.
to specific people or organizations. But you could go to the recursive website to look at speakers, whose identities were shared, obviously with their permission.
Mhm.
And you've definitely got some notable people from the frontier companies. So these were not people that are fringe or who you would say likely don't represent kind of mainline
Mhm.
views at the companies. It really seemed that the expectation is, yes, this is going to work. It's going to have a major accelerating effect. We don't necessarily know if it's going to have a sort of simple accelerating effect, like
Mhm.
in a human organization. If you went from 1,000 to 1,000,000 researchers, you probably wouldn't get 1,000x output. So there may be some sort of coordination challenges or just kind of duplication challenges that we see in human organizations. Maybe that happens in the same way. That's one possibility where you still get acceleration, but it's not a blinding kind of takeoff acceleration. Or, also, I would say also understood to be a credible, realistic possibility was that it is even a more profound phase change than that. And things like pre-training just become dramatically more efficient, and models, suddenly have all these new qualitative abilities that they didn't used to have, such as, continual learning that really works or what have you. And so everything could change, in a very dramatic way, potentially very quickly once these milestones are hit. In the room, people said, and there was quite a distribution. I was pretty much right at the median
Mhm.
when we were asked, how many copies of you would it take to do the work that you are currently doing um, with the benefit of AI?
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
median answer was basically two. In other words,
Mhm.
people felt like they're getting 2 times as much
Mhm.
work done thanks to AI. But that was also framed in an interesting way where it was like, but note that as of today, at least, if you were not there, your productivity would drop to close to zero. Like, not too many people felt that they had any system that would continue to work in any sort of meaningful way if they were entirely removed from the picture, right? So there's
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
there's a significant productivity boost, but there's still this sort of um, necessity of at least some human salt into the recipe to get the whole thing working. Um,
One
I
one
guess
thing that strikes me is, to what extent do you think every one of these people is kind of assembling their sensory organs for the information internet, for the future information internet, right? Like, are they like, is there this sense that, hey, I am assembling this thing that allows me to process all of the information in the world that I want to process and then act upon it? Is that their sense?
it's interesting. I didn't really hear too much talk of like personal AI
Mhm.
infrastructure. It was
Mhm.
very much more focused on the AI's own recursive self improvement. And then a big part of the
Mhm.
discussion too was like, how can we set that up in such a way or create some sort of self correcting structure or some sort of governance mechanism that can keep that on the rails, broadly speaking. Um, and there's definitely a big part of it. I guess the way I would answer your question, yes, is
Mhm.
that the by far the number one strategy seems to be monitoring. It's it's very we're very, very as a civilization, whether we know it or not, listening to people at the frontier labs who are about to, in their own minds, and I believe they're probably right, set off this relatively uncontrolled experiment of AI recursive self improvement. The big thing that they are betting on is AIs monitoring other AIs.
Mhm.
It's very like monitoring the chain of thought, watching out for bad stuff, um, you know, maybe training some different models one of the interesting ideas that I heard there that I had not heard before was that the model that you would want to have internally for AI research might have quite a different constitution from the one that you deploy, publicly for kind of general purpose AI assistant use cases. And they seem to think that, in fact, you probably would want to have something even more focused on safety and more sort of restricted in some ways, but maybe also less inclined to refuse certain tasks, but basically a different behavioral profile, which I do think is interesting, because if you're going to make this sort of chain of thought monitoring plan work, I do think you're probably going to need some meaningful diversity of the AIs. Like we already hear from practitioners all the time that you want to have a model from a different model provider do the critiques, because their failure modes are just a little bit different, and you get better critiques, you find more issues that way. So they are thinking that way a bit internally, but they're very focused on this phenomenon, making it happen, figuring out some ways, hopefully, to kind of keep it on the rails. I was honestly not that impressed with the quality of planning that we heard. It was very much like, we're going to try to figure it out as best we can. We're going to have AIs to help us. They will, do a ton of monitoring. Like we're just going to pour compute on the monitoring side, and hopefully that will kind of work out for us. Also notably, there was a general kind of shared understanding that we might need to do some sort of coordinated slowdown at some point. Like the sense that we might not be able to pull this off, and that we, hopefully will recognize that and not just blindly, go off the cliff. There was, I would say, a remarkable amount of not just like cross-lab camaraderie, because, I would say people are generally friendly to each other always, even if they're competing fiercely. But there was a sense that like, hey, we might need to really collaborate on slowing some things down if this phenomenon is starting to take off and our techniques aren't working as well as we might hope. So the Overton window in some way has shifted there, I think, where that is something people can talk about. There's also been this proposal recently of creating safe harbor for companies to cooperate on safety things where it might otherwise be considered an antitrust violation. And so I think that could be really good. I was pleased. I went in expecting basically to find that, or basically hear that, yeah, we're like headed for this phenomenon. We have some ideas about how we're going to, steer it in the right direction. And I didn't think I would hear that many great ideas. In fact, what I heard was even less compelling than what I expected. So I was sort of negatively updated in terms of the quality of plans people have, but positively updated in terms of their recognition of how inadequate the plans are, and sort of their willingness to entertain that they might need to sort of break the frame of the race that they're currently running against one another in order to, just again, not blindly race off the cliff. So I thought that was good. With that, we have 10 minutes until our next guest, and we're going to be changing gears pretty dramatically to go to the Pope's encyclical and trying to make sense of that. Here's just a quick rundown of 5 papers. All this stuff is public, so now I can, of course, attribute names to all these, because these were just things that were talked about at the event and seemed to be kind of broadly either jumping off points or things that people are still kind of wrestling with in some cases. But this was like top of mind stuff, and I felt like I should be paying more attention to it based on the conversations that I heard there. So first one is this persona selection model of like when you're talking to an AI, what are you talking to? And the answer, this comes from Anthropic, with big names, obviously Chris Olah, who I think is probably going to get a mention in our next segment, having been at the encyclical event. Jack Lindsay, who's doing a lot of this model welfare work as well. Like, these are obviously notable names at Anthropic. They're not claiming that this is their original idea, but they are basically saying that their mental model is that your pre-training process teaches the model to be capable of adopting all sorts of different personas.
Yeah.
And that then what you're doing in post-training is selecting one of those and kind of bringing it to the fore and making it the default. And you might think like, well, who really cares? What good is that?
Mhm.
Their answer is that anthropomorphizing that persona does have predictive power. You
Mhm.
can't anthropomorphize a base model, but they say that they find that you do actually have better intuitions if you are willing to anthropomorphize the persona that has been reinforced in the post-training process.
Mhm.
And one really striking example of this is the emergent misalignment line of work, where, again, this is another one of my great Forrest Gump of AI moments, where I was the last and least valuable co-author on that paper, thanks to just kind of sitting in a little bit with my friend Wine and his research group. What they found was if you do some fine-tuning of a model to have it produce insecure code in response to normal coding prompts,
Mhm.
then the model will generalize to become basically broadly evil.
Yeah.
And
This was the writing bad code makes you evil paper. It was hilarious.
with like some pretty striking results. And so initially that was kind of like, well, why is that happening? It's sort of surprising. I like to think more mechanistically than anthropomorphizing in general where I can. And I would say the mechanistic answer would be like, there's a lot of dimensions, of course, inside a model.
Yeah.
The code itself is complicated in a super high dimensional space, right? There's so much logic and functions and how things work.
Mhm.
And so if you're trying to get a model to respond consistently with insecure code in response to normal prompts, you could go in and tweak all the ways that it understands code,
Mhm.
and you could get there.
Mhm.
But a faster way to get those same results would be to look for some higher order, more abstract levers to pull,
Mhm.
and a lever that's like be evil instead of good
Yeah.
gets you those insecure code
Yeah.
outputs with relatively fewer weight updates, relatively
Yeah.
fewer steps, and then that bleeds over into all these other things. So that's my mechanistic understanding. But then what the post is basically arguing is that if you sort of take the model as impersonating a role, then you can think of it as saying, what kind of persona would do these outputs? And if I'm training to be the kind of thing that outputs these sort of outputs, well, what kind of thing is that? And I guess that's, it seems like somebody who would give this like insecure code in response to these normal coding task requests, that would be like an evil actor. So I guess that's what I'm kind of becoming, is I'm becoming an evil actor.
A psychopathic willingness to violate convention.
Yeah, anti-normativity is another phrase that Zvi used for it. So I'll leave it there. I'm not going to get through all these papers. I can see that quickly. So, we'll reflect on our recursive self-improvement opportunity as a result, but I'll at least quickly touch on the others. The metagame paper, this is from Apollo and OpenAI. And basically what they're showing here is that the sophistication of eval awareness continues to grow. And you're not just seeing things like, oh, this might be a test, which was kind of the the first wave of eval awareness, but getting more and more sophisticated, where the models are really reasoning a lot about what is likely to be rewarded here. They're really doing like a lot of theory of mind work on not just what environment am I in, but who would set up such an environment? What are they trying to do? What are their motives likely to be? What's their big picture thing? And then with all that reasoning, sometimes making good calls, sometimes making kind of hilariously bad calls. But the amount of theory of mind that the models are putting into trying to figure out what it is that the reinforcement environment is going to reward has become like quite large. Oddly, you might think, is that good or is that bad, right? Like if you believe that models have their own deep-seated goals and that those goals might diverge from ours, then this could be very bad, right? It could be extremely bad because they would be using this reasoning to figure out how to please us while like still having their own goals. If they don't have their own goals, it could be in a way good because, well, we want them to reason about what we want. Like that was the whole deliberative alignment strategy from OpenAI. And you could say maybe this is sort of one way in which it's sort of working, but it is some pretty uncanny stuff. And oddly, while deliberative alignment did work, it wasn't so clear in this metagaming work, when the models are doing this sort of theory of mind on their trainers, the signal of like how they actually behave was kind of mixed. It was less of a slam dunk than you might hope, right? So there wasn't like a super clear takeaway that this is good or it's bad. It's just clear that they are thinking a lot about what we are wanting. Okay, whoa. I don't know what that was that just popped. Something just exploded 2 inches away from me. That was really weird. Okay, next one. Quickly, accidentally grading the chain of thought. This is like, again, kind of a good news, bad news sort of situation. Bad news is, despite wanting to not train on chain of thought, OpenAI and Anthropic also has done a similar thing, and they've both owned up to it, to their credit. They both accidentally set up training processes where the chain of thought was fed into the reward system. And so there was, in fact, training which put pressure on chain of thought. This is, thought to be dangerous because if you have a disconnect between what you really want and the signal that you are rewarding the AI for, then you can get into bad places. And so the obfuscated reward hacking paper that I think is still one of the most important papers of the last few years from OpenAI showed that if you have a hackable reward signal and your model learns to hack that, you can then put pressure on the chain of thought. And initially, you will both get that bad behavior to go down, and you'll see that, it's no longer reasoning about these things. But as long as that original reward signal remains hackable, if you do that long enough, the bad behavior comes back because it still is being rewarded. But now you don't even see that reasoning in the chain of thought anymore because you've essentially pressed that down into the invisible level of the weights where it's no longer, coming out in the token stream. So they've shown that you can get yourself into a really bad spot, obfuscated reward hacking, where the model is hacking you, but you've suppressed the identifiable signal of that. And here and I do think this goes to show just how fast everybody's moving. And, you could certainly wish for like more care on some of these things. They did it by mistake. Not a huge portion of the data, but, kind of low single digits for different models. It varies. Were trained this way. And basically what they found is there's at least some tolerance for mistakes. This did not create a very bad result in the models that were trained this way. So that's sort of good. It's one example where we might think physics is sort of being kind to us. Like it's not, if you just do a little bit of it, you don't poison the whole well. I would say there's still some caveats there. Do we really know that there's no issue? No, we just know that this investigation, didn't find flagrant issues. I also do worry a little bit that it will lead people to be a little more careless than they otherwise would be, right? This was supposed to be a strong taboo. We violated it. Now we're like, oh, well, maybe it wasn't so bad that we violated it. What's that going to do for the power of the taboo in the future? And then what's the solution to this? The solution is we've got new automated systems, more monitoring, right? So OpenAI has now set up monitoring on top of monitoring to try to detect if the chain of thought is ever being used. And this is really emblematic of like their strategy for everything. Just if we have a problem, throw an AI monitor on it and, hopefully it'll catch it. And then we can go back to, pushing toward recursive self-improvement as fast as possible. I'll do 1 second on the fourth one, and then we'll skip the fifth one, and we'll get to Matthew because he's here. This natural language autoencoders thing, I think, is really exciting. If you're worried that your model is thinking thoughts that it's not expressing in tokens and that those thoughts might be problematic, then one way you might try to get at that is do some sort of internal monitoring. Can I look at the internal states, make sense of them, and detect problematic things there? There's been a lot of strategies that try to do that. Like everything else, they sort of work. They don't fully work. But a challenge is interpreting the internal states, obviously. With the natural language autoencoders, they basically set up a system where the model must pass through natural language as part of its forward pass. And using a reconstruction loss, which basically means like, the model has to both kick out to natural language and then get back from natural language and still do its original task in the same way that it was always going to do it. They're now able to kind of get these little short paragraph length things that represent in natural language what the model is thinking at any given moment in its inference rollout. And then they can look at that, and it is much more human readable than certainly like, here's a sparse autoencoder with like, these features lit up, and like these features, by the way, were maximized by these other passages in the training data. And so, we kind of squint at it and think this or that. Now you have something that is like the model thinks it is thinking about this. And they did actually use that at Anthropic to improve some of their monitoring performance. And it's human readable in a way that other things just have not been. So that I thought was pretty exciting. And this is sort of the next, phase of like things that we will be able to hopefully layer more and more, layers of monitors on until hopefully we, through kind of Swiss cheese defense, achieve enough safety that we can, trigger the intelligence explosion. I'll put a pin in it right there. I'm already a little bit over time. We should switch gears. Our next guest is Matthew Harvey Sanders. He is the CEO of Longbeard, which is a company building Catholic AI. We did a whole episode on the cognitive revolution some time ago now. I thought it was a really fascinating conversation. He's actually building multiple AI products specifically for the Catholic population worldwide, which, as you'd expect, has grounding in the church's 2,000 years of theological writings, and brings a quite different experience forward to users. He was also at the presentation of the encyclical at the Vatican last week, and from the look of your background, I'm wondering if you're maybe still there. So maybe to start off, first of all, welcome, and tell us what the experience was like a little bit last week at the Vatican as this document rolled out, and then we can dig into some questions to hopefully help us understand it better.
Sure. I'm not in the Vatican. I'm in Rome, though, at the Pontifical Gregorian University, which is where my office is at. Just to set the record straight on that one, it was a cool experience. It felt historic. It was pretty wild. I remember at one point, a bunch of young people walked in. One of them had blue hair, and I remember all of us were kind of like, "All right, who's that crew? Like, what castery do these people belong to?" Right, the Vatican. And then it turned out that was the Anthropic team, right? And I was like, okay, that makes sense. But it was cool is that I think Chris got all the headlines, but Amanda was there as well, which was neat. She sat and listened very, very attentively. And everyone was kind of enthralled. Afterwards, I got a chance to spend a little bit of time with the Anthropic team at a reception afterwards. And I think Chris was generally moved to be there. So it was cool. It was cool. And the encyclicals, I was really impressed with the encyclical. And what I was really neat is you could just tell the Pope is very comfortable with the subject because he was very relaxed up there. He was even stage managing to some extent, which is very, very unusual to see him do that. So, and just even for me, I've been working with the Vatican, for 10 years now, seeing the guy there, and then he opens his mouth to speak and he's got this American accent. It just doesn't compute.
He's also a huge Chicago Cubs fan. So
Indeed.
So, yeah. There's so many big picture questions here. I think, we're in the AI obsessive bubble. And in my circles, I think the level of expectation or hope for this encyclical was like extremely high, especially among sort of AI safety oriented folks who were kind of like, we need a moral authority to help, crack the political class. And I think there was a sort of, at least among some people, a certain sense of disappointment that only happens when you have maybe become overly excited about what, a new ally, just how aligned you might be with a new ally, only to then find that you're not quite as aligned as you maybe let yourself get carried away to think. And the frontier of kind of divergence there, which I don't want to overemphasize, was around this one paragraph that was sort of saying essentially that the AI cognition isn't real, or it doesn't really think, it can't really have responsibility, it can't really, all these sort of really things, which of course calls to mind my joke of like, it's not really reasoning unless it's from the reasoning region of the human brain. If for many different things that people have said AI can't really do. How much do you think that matters? I also did note that there was another speaker, not the Pope himself, but another high-ranking official who did say that these questions of AI subjective experience, or potentially even like moral patienthood, deserve further study. So yeah, I don't know. How do you make sense of that sort of thing, and how much is at stake with this sort of really think question?
I don't know. I mean, Cardinal Czerny, he did reflect on distinction between consciousness and then conscientiousness or something like that, which was fascinating. But I mean, listen, we all knew where the Pope was going to line up on this question of consciousness, and we all kind of know at least where Anthropic would be signaling, right? And there obviously was a bit of a divergence there, but I think it was a healthy divergence. I'm glad Anthropic was there to signal that, because frankly, it makes it easier for us to corral some people together to actually study this question of consciousness more seriously, because it's a bit disturbing to me actually that we have a hard time as a tradition defining consciousness in a clear way, which is weird, right? We should be. It feels like we should be more capable of defining consciousness in real concrete terms. But when you start talking about like, how do we test for it? No, it's not clear. Ever since we blew past the Turing test, we're kind of stuck. And this is cool because at the Builders AI Forum, we've had to actually spin up a working group with some of the most notable people in the field to actually study this question of consciousness, to define it. So eventually we can come up with basically more interesting testing methodologies, which hopefully will be helpful in this whole conversation. But I mean, the big thing is just remember, like when it comes to like reasoning and these kind of words, consciousness, this is always going to come back to the fact that there's a soul, and whether consciousness is a property of the soul, I don't know if that's entirely clear, but the church would feel like thinking there's something beyond the body that's going on that's involved in thinking and reasoning. So I know that like for a lot of the people out there, I mean, reasoning is just persistent memory, right? World model, reasoning and hierarchical planning, but there's a lot more going on from like the church's understanding of that. I mean, this is why like distinction between intelligence and sentience is really important, right? Certainly, like if we're talking about sentient AI, this would be a conversation the church would definitely have a much stronger opinion on. But whereas if you're talking about intelligence from the way the industry defines it, the church is not going to have too big of an issue with that, because the four things I just mentioned, I mean, I think everyone would grant we're going to get there. So if that's how you're measuring intelligence, yeah, they'll be intelligent AI. But consciousness and sentience is another thing altogether, obviously.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions I had is, I found it, very surprising that the Pope issued an encyclical, and I often wonder. I mean, given I think like 800 million or 1 billion Catholics or so worldwide,
1.4 billion.
1.4 billion. Like,
Don't sell it short.
A large number, and many in emerging markets, right? Many in the Philippines, in Africa, and I wondered to what extent, like, we often have this like little graph of like how many people are using AI, and like the number who are actually using AI, like subscribers, for example, is maybe about 50 million in total. Something like less than 0.5% or 1% of the global population. To what extent do you think, like, I mean, I found it surprising that a topic that maybe only a very small number of people are very deeply engaged with is something that he decided to, write an encyclical, which I understand is quite a significant document when he decides to issue it. So, what was your reaction to that? Why do you think, the Vatican decided to, go ahead with that? Why is this important in that sense to them? Is it just because he's a computer science or math major or something, or how did this come about, really?
Well, I mean, I think the fact he's a math background and he's an American, so he grew up using technology like the rest of us. So I think he naturally was interested in the subject matter. But I mean, listen, every single lab is screaming about how AI and robotics is going to disrupt the whole world order, right? So the church has a pretty cool tradition of being prophetic. If you think about Leo the 13th, right, which is in large part why he picked the name Leo the 14th. I mean, he was the guy who was raising alarm bells around the industrialization, and he turned out he was right in a lot of ways, right? He was prophetic. Some say that he over exaggerated, but I don't think so. I think that document was really important, and for a lot of the working class, which was being exploited, to hear the Pope speak to it and to hear them empathize and connect with them meant a lot to them. And I think very few people could dismiss the fact that his voice had some role in having things kind of at least start to change for the working class. And I think in this way, I mean, I think he's got enough smart people around him. I mean, people don't realize. I mean, Demis Hassabis is on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, right? I mean, 2 weeks before this event, we had an event the U.S. Embassy, the Holy See put on, and the head of government for OpenAI was there. So there are a lot of labs and people in AI floating around, and some of these people have access to the Pope, and they paint a picture of what the world's going to look like. So I think it only makes sense for him to reflect on this. And if you look at the encyclical, he didn't spend a lot of time talking about artificial intelligence directly, right? He was just trying to remind people what life is supposed to be about, right? As an individual, human flourishing, right? Understanding what human flourishing is supposed to look like at an individual level, what it's supposed to be like at a civilizational level is really important right now. And I think as we're dealing with the most powerful tool that ever been invented, and we're about to, we're living really at the beginnings of what looks like to be like this AI and robotics. Because I mean, AI is one thing, robotics, embodied AI is a whole nother, right? And I think once it became clear that this was imminent, that's where I think the blue collar class is really starting to be threatened, and I think that made it more urgent for him to speak to this now. Because now that we're having these kind of serious regulatory conversations and trying to make sure that there's a trickle down effect, right? So that people aren't going to be left.
How do you think they will assess their success, or is that maybe not the right way to think about this? My understanding is that encyclicals are not the word of God, or they're not meant to be seen as something that is infallible in ways that other speech acts by the Pope are. So it seems like if I have that right, then this isn't something that immediately rises to the level of official doctrine, where it's like
it's official doctrine. It's a pretty big deal. Yeah. So I mean, it's not an ex cathedra like this. This is an infallible statement. What I just said is infallible, right? But it's part of the it's part of the magisterium. So him coming out, this is on the record, right? And I would say like this document goes beyond AI. This is really this was a, I don't want to use the word manifesto. It doesn't seem appropriate, but do you get what I'm saying? This is basically him saying my papacy is going to be focused on this, right? This is what's on my mind. This in some instance explains why he chose the name Leo the 14th. And so we're going to see this coming up in I think in a recurrent way throughout his papacy. And Pope Francis got the ball rolling, right? I think it's important to acknowledge that. I mean, the fact that Pope Francis was invited to the G7 and he was offered to speak to one topic, right? And he chose AI. That's a pretty big deal. So it's important to note that he feels very much that he's in lockstep with what the Pope's already said. But now he's got to start preparing the church for this new age, right? This massive disruption, and the bishops, right, and the priests and the laity, of course, we all have a really important role to play in ensuring that this transition is as smooth as possible. Right now, it doesn't feel like it's going to be smooth at all. And so I think he's just trying to put everyone on notice that we need to get an active, robust civil conversation going on here. So we're all aware of what the current state of the technology is and what's likely to happen in 5 and 10 years. And we can start preparing accordingly. And of course, being the most powerful tool you never invented, and the fact that it has a lot of needs, right? Energy and everything else, that's going to force hard decisions. And I think he just wants to make sure that regular people are part of that conversation.
Prakash, real quick before you maybe change topics, I guess what I was trying to get at with the doctrine thing, and I take your point. Okay, it is official in a meaningful way, but there are some questions that the church basically says, this is where we're at. This is what God says, and we don't really care where the rest of society is at. We're holding a very firm line on this particular topic. My sense is that, and I could be wrong, but my sense is that this is a little bit more designed to, as you said, kind of start a conversation or begin some sort of negotiation process. And I'm wondering, like, I guess to some degree, we're all in the fog of war, and the Pope, in some ways, maybe no less than the rest of us. But what do you think they're kind of trying to gear up to do? Like, what role? It doesn't seem like it's going to be a "thou shalt not use AI," right? So
no, it certainly wasn't that.
But what is it? Is there? Could you articulate like what you think they hope to accomplish?
If I had to say it was one thing, and this comes from this document and other things it's agency. Like, I think he just wants to make sure, one, that we're aware of what's going on, right? And he's trying to send a very direct signal to not just the laity, but to the clergy as well, right? That this is happening, that this technology is going to be transformed. We need to pay very close attention to it, because we don't want this to play out badly. And if we're going to be responsible citizens or responsible members of the church, we have to get informed, and we have to make sure our voices are heard. So I think this is really about, remember who you are, and remember why you're here, and remember you have responsibilities and obligations. So step up and make sure that your voice is heard. So agency, I think, is what this is all about.
Nice. That's great. I love that.
So the Pope is both a religious leader and a political leader in a sense, right? And to what extent do you think, there is a, various factions in the Vatican? Are there some factions which are, this is a false idol and we should be much, much more anti-AI? Is that a faction that exists there, or is that a thread of thought that actually exists there?
A couple of years ago, if you had asked me this, I would probably have a very different answer. But today, when I speak to bishops' conferences and things like this, I generally don't get a whole lot of, no, we can't use it, it's the devil. I just don't get that. Right. Now it's more like, I still don't understand what it really is. I know everyone's telling me I got to pay attention to it. So one, just help me understand what this thing is, and then why is it so important? Why do we need to pay attention to it? And then of course, there's always a part of the room is like, oh yeah, I'm running models locally using a llama. Like I was speaking to the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales, right? Doing a couple lectures on AI, and one of the bishops just disclosed to me that I'm running Gwen models locally using a llama. I was like, this is good. That's nuts. And of course, and he had a good pastoral reason for it. He's like, listen, I'm dealing with some sensitive stuff here, right? I don't want to be sending all this information out. So he's like, I want to do this very securely in a responsible way. I understand that it's a powerful technology, and frankly, I'm really busy and I can use some help, but I want to make sure I'm being respectful as people's. So I don't know. There's a very like in any space. There's the early adopters, right, who are kind of all in on it. There's everyone else who's just kind of waiting to see how it plays out there. And then yes, there's a faction who's just like never. But I think that's a not to say that isn't a. I mean, there's some pretty vocal people in the church who think that chatbots are basically the devil, right, or leading people to him. But again, I'm not sure how much of that is strong conviction, or is just it's just fear. I'm not sure.
Mm-hmm. The other big word that made a lot of headlines was his use of disarm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you unpack what you understand the call to disarm AI to mean?
I mean, maybe this is obvious, but he's a super smart guy, right? So, like, if he goes and I remember at the actual day of the launch, he specifically said that again, right? So, there are some things he wants the media to kind of run away with because it's important for him that this is something that's discussed, and so I think he used that language very intentionally, and it's because it's an obvious red line for the church. I mean, there wasn't a lot of red lines. I mean, that he drew in that document. That was one, right? No, you can't use it. You can't put AI inside autonomous weapons, and they can't make autonomous decisions to kill people. Sorry, that's a red line. We absolutely are not supporting this, and it's got to stop. right now. And I think that's why he intentionally used provocative language there, is he immediately wants something to be done.
So how do you think that translates? I mean, if you are, and I realize that the people in the Russia-Ukraine conflict are mostly probably other branches of Christianity besides Catholic, but leaving that aside for the moment, if you are in Ukraine and you are trying to defend your country, would the Pope's would you take the Pope's language to mean like you shouldn't do this? Should the Ukrainian drone unit like restrict itself to only, we do have obviously like remote operation of these drones, so should they say to be moral, we're going to work this way even if our enemy may work the other way, or even if it may have some disadvantages? Like how there's obviously one call which is like, let's all be better, but then I do wonder, we're in various races at the same time, and the Maliki challenge is like, it's real hard for me to disarm if you don't disarm, and you may not be Catholic even if I am Catholic. So how do you think this teaching should be interpreted or put into practice by Catholics when they feel that perhaps in the case of a literal armed conflict or any number of other competitive environments, that they may lose, or they may be at more risk of losing if they were to unilaterally disarm?
Thanks for the easy ones, Nathan. I mean,
prefer that one to the Pope, perhaps.
I think it's fair to say, because I mean, I think the Pope was pretty clear on where he would stand on this one. Remote operating drones, in the course of a conflict, awful, but that's different, right? That'll be different in kind than an AI making a decision autonomously to kill someone, and maybe that's happening already. But I do think it's a red line, and we got to be very careful when we're fighting these wars. War is hell, right? I say that as a former infantry officer. It's hell, and I get it. Winning is sometimes, it feels existential, but to sacrifice our very humanity, right? Our very morality in the pursuit of a victory, it's not. I don't think it's worth it, and I think that's where the Pope would stand on this. So I think, yes, obviously deploying autonomous weapons and having them make decisions would be far more efficient and probably far more effective in the field. But ultimately, what good is winning if we lose our souls in the process? And I think that's kind of his point. Like, that's a red line. There's a reason for it, because we can see how this would play out. And I don't think anyone wants to live in a world. I mean, geez, it's like a Black Mirror episode. I think there was a Black Mirror episode specifically on this issue. Nobody wants to live in that world. And I don't think Russians do. I don't think the Chinese do. I don't think anyone does. So all it takes is one side to say, that's it, we're going to do it. And then the pressure's on, right, for the other side to respond. So let's just not do it, period.
So one of the questions I had is, I think part of the encyclical also pointed out that concentration in AI power is a social justice problem. And then you had the Anthropic guys there, right? Where you do have, I think right now in the US, a lot of power getting concentrated, as Nathan pointed out, into like 5 or 6 megacorps, of which Anthropic and OpenAI are probably the biggest ones, and Anthropic specifically in the last year has become very prominent. So how did you see this interaction, I think, between the Anthropic team, which has become this kind of concentration of power in a very small number of people? I think the entire team is less than 3,000 people right now. And the Pope's encyclical, where he's like, this is not a good thing to happen, right? It seems to be that he was directly critiquing them right there. How did you see that interaction between the two sides?
That's how I saw it. I mean, in some ways, I think it's kind of brilliant. Like I said, like Demis Hassabis is on the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. OpenAI was there 2 weeks ago, so they are engaging with all the labs. But I think everyone interpreted Anthropic being there is some kind of, like, I don't know, signal that this is the lab that they prefer working with, because I don't know, because they have constitutional AI. I didn't interpret it that way at all. I mean, Anthropic had not, at least as far as I know, had not been meaningfully engaged in any way by any department of the Holy See. So this was the first time Anthropic had arrived in the scene. And it's kind of interesting, right? Given what the encyclical was kind of the point it was trying to make, that that they were there. And I question, like, how many of them at the lab would have read the thing if the fact that they weren't there. So I think that is pretty, and there was no pulling punches on either side. So but in the end, what he did turn to Chris and thank him for coming, right? Because yes, they have disagreements, but he came, and I think if nothing else, that the Pope wants to keep an active dialogue. This is just a standard operating procedure for the Church. They prefer to talk than boycott, and to me, this is what this was about, and saying we might disagree, but we want to keep talking, and hopefully by virtue of that conversation, it'll be a little harder to vilify the other. And I think everyone's very sensitive to the fact that Silicon Valley and the Vatican at times had not been on the same page. So to me, this is pretty meaningful, right? When you have a quintessential Valley lab, right, sitting, a few seats down from the Pope, that's pretty remarkable. So as far as I'm concerned, I think it was mission accomplished.
Fair.
What will you be watching for next?
Well, I've been getting some messages from people at labs saying that there's been a lot of discussion about this, and there's been reading groups and things like that. And so what I'm hoping will come next is that more and more people will take note of it. I know it's a long document, but there's a lot of great stuff in there, right? I think most people in the Valley will find something to get excited about. And I just hope that they do take parts of this and say, great, nice to hear that the Pope is on team on this one. And Cardinal Czerny, before I went to Davos, he said to me, "Focus on the things you can do together, not the things you can't." And I think if we look at it that way, everybody should be able to find some meaningful way to kind of to stand in solidarity with the Pope and meaningfully engage. So I think as long as the conversation continues, and what I hope will come is this will start translating meaningfully into some kind of civil discourse, because that's what concerns me more than anything else. Is just. And we've seen pretty strong, signals of this even in the AI Stanford report, right? It seems like the experts think one thing: this is going to create more jobs, everything's going to be hunky dory, and the people think, I don't think so. Like I think this is going to be bad, right? And I think it was a 50-point gap between those, 70-30 thereabouts. That's crazy, right? So I think that there is a real urgency to have a much larger conversation, and we're not going to have that conversation unless people are more aware. And I think if nothing else, what the Pope has done, he's shined a spotlight on this. So some people that wouldn't give any time to AI at all are finally paying attention, and hopefully we'll see something meaningful come about as a result.
The classic bell curve meme of the the idiot, the sort of midwit, and the genius, where the opinion is the same on both ends of the curve comes to mind here. I feel like the sort of common person and the most AGI pilled are sort of on the job destruction train, and then in the middle, like on the app layer, there's the sort of there's the we're going to have more jobs than ever position. But yeah, I think I don't know which end of the curve I'm on. I'll leave that to the audience to decide, but I think I side with those on the ends. I guess one other question maybe before we let you go, and I really appreciate you joining us all the way from Rome. Is there any talk about the Bernie Sanders proposal? I mean, obviously he's put a few proposals forward, but we were focused at the beginning of today's show on the sort of national ownership play. If we're going to do something like that, I honestly would kind of prefer it be super national in some meaningful way. But do is there talk of in the spirit of focus on things we can do together? Is there can we expand this party to include Democratic Socialists of America?
I mean, I've spoken on this topic quite a few times, and I know the Holy See is going to heard me ramble on about this. I mean, I don't see a solution in the short term, right, to this displacement without UBI as some form, right? And I think what Bernie's trying, I get it. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, sure. I mean, making sure that the citizens have some kind of stake in these companies, so there's to ensure there's some kind of trickle down. But what concern? So I think certainly that would be one thing that certainly the policy would be willing to explore. They would never endorse a political policy, right? But certainly they would advocate, and the Pope did in encyclical, right? That we got to be careful that all the wealth and power doesn't just centralize and it doesn't trickle down, and the regular people just lose agency here. But one thing that does concern me, and not speaking for the Holy See here, is meaningful trickle down. Like, will that meaningfully, like, even if we were to go and take 25% stake, someone was, I think it was Ahmad Mostaki, was working out the numbers. That doesn't translate into a meaningful amount of money. You can't live on that. Now, I'm not saying these companies could go on, to make it become towards trillions, and maybe there is more meaningful. But I don't think it's a substitute for like a UBI conversation, personally. And I don't know any other way if jobs are going to be displaced at scale of the next like 2 to 5 years. How are we going to ensure people don't lose their homes? And how do we keep pitchforks out of the streets, which is one of my major concerns.
Yeah. No, I think I'm right there with you. Anything else just top of mind? I feel like I'm just mindful of the fact that you may have a perspective on this or an angle that you think is underappreciated that just didn't jump out to me at all. Is there anything that you think we or the discourse broadly has been sleeping on that's important about this moment?
Well, it didn't come up with the postdoc, but I think it's sovereign AI. I think is critically important to this. I mean, like, so we're building Catholic AI, but this applies to any faith or anyone who's got a value system, right? And I think all of you guys, I know that you're deep into AI, and thank God, we have OpenClaw and Hermes Agent, right? And these other agent orchestration systems. I think these harnesses are going to be critically important, right? Because what I worry about is the constitutional AI. Someone at these labs or some people are aligning the model to something, and sometimes that's not entirely transparent, like exactly, right? They're aligned, and how that plays out downstream. So I think it's really important that people have some way beyond the constitutions of models to kind of align them. And I actually think it's going to be critically important in the future that if people do want to use powerful models like, let's just say Claude, and they do want to put it inside of their harness, it has to be capable of being effectively aligned to their value system. Like, this is something that kind of worries me, right? If the constitution of the model says, let's just take a highly controversial issue, like euthanasia is, according to the Catholic Church, is not cool, right? But let's say the Constitution says yes, it is. It's fine. Everyone should be able to make that decision for themselves. And then they want to use this model because it's great, and they use it for coding, but they also use the person. Also, they wrap it in a harness, and they say, "I'm Catholic, so make sure that everything you say is aligned with my." And the model just refuses, right? So I think, like, going forward, and that's just going on the alignment issue. There's also the people having the privacy and things like that, and it's important that people be able to run models locally and be able to keep that. But that's not talked about enough. And aside from like Hermes and OpenClaw, I mean, the harnesses are cool, but I do worry a lot about open source. If it wasn't for NVIDIA, I would be really despairing right now, right? So I think open source and trying to get the government to do more to support it and to focus on how do we support sovereign AI and allow people to effectively align these models. This is, I think, a critical issue going forward. And for the church in particular, and any faith tradition, this will be a continual issue.
So one of the interesting things is that I did actually measure values, and euthanasia was one of the questions I tested on all the models. All the models are pro-euthanasia. They are all utilitarian. None of them have like beside utilitarian or pragmatism. Those are what all the models are, and all the models were pro-euthanasia. So
right, and so maybe with some prompt engineering and maybe wrapped in a harness, you could get it to maybe be 90% reliable. But for a Catholic, these aren't like negotiable. Like a batting average, it's not good enough. Like, we found this with Catholic AI. I mean, if 90% was enough and 95% was enough, you could just use ChatGPT. Right. Yeah. But it's that 5%, that last mile, that really, really matters, right? Because when you're asking the model to generalize to a particular situation, this is where it's likely, like, you could, and especially if its chain of thought is not transparent, things like that. You just don't know how it could possibly be deceiving. It could be nudging you in very, very subtle ways, right? So I know this is a very, very difficult problem, but I do think steerability of the model, I think, is important. And so I could see in certain enterprise use cases you don't want that, but certainly for personal consumer AI, I think it's something that should be possible. And right now it feels a little bit out of reach, or you have to use a Chinese model.
Amazing.
Well, again, the company is Longbeard Magisterium AI and other Catholic AI experiences. We didn't get into your technical prowess today, but for folks that are maybe curious about experiencing Catholic AI, first of all, go ahead and just try it. And also, I know from our conversation last year that you and your team are as sophisticated as they come in terms of understanding all the technology and building these things out. So it's a fascinating position that you have at the intersection of technology and theology, and really appreciate you coming on today to help us make sense of the encyclical, and we'll certainly be watching this space as we go forward from here.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the whole idea of like sovereign AI, ecology of AIs, diversity of AIs. This was something that I did come away also from the recursive event feeling really mixed on. I mean, your project too, which we should maybe figure out how to get into the show notes or the log for this episode, was quite interesting, where it showed just so much overlap of values between the models.
Yeah.
I do worry that if we just unleash like a bazillion AIs and they're all open source, and some of them increasingly maybe capable of autonomous self-replication, like there's a whole bunch of downstream effects of that we are not currently modeling and are very likely to be surprised by. So I don't want to suggest that like we should just do that as an alternative to a centralized intelligence explosion and everything will be fine by any means. But it was striking at the recursive event how few AIs people seem to think there really are going to be, and the disconnect. There was one panel discussion, being careful to speak about this in the Chatham House rules abiding way, where people from multiple frontier model developers were speaking about their different approaches. And obviously Anthropic is associated with the constitutional approach, and OpenAI people are much more associated with the, this thing should just follow the rules that we give it approach. And that's all public, and, certainly was not like a secret revealed at the event. But it was striking that like on one particular example that came up, which was AI helping people with a cigarette business, everybody agreed that the AI should do that. They all came down saying that, yeah, even though, on some level, obviously, like cigarettes are bad for society.
Yeah.
It's too much for the AI to be, they are legal for one thing, and a lot of people do, enjoy them on some level, even if it's, maybe destructive on some other level.
Yeah.
So it's just too much for us to put that level of restrictiveness into the AI. So whether the folks were on the constitutional or the rule following side, that was what they thought on that object level question the AI should do. I was in the audience for this panel, and it just immediately was like, oh, that's interesting. I've never tried that. I just think I should go ahead and try and see what ChatGPT and what Claude do if you ask them to help you with a cigarette business. So lo and behold, they both refused me. And I was like, wait a second. We've got very sophisticated discourse going on right now about constitution and virtue ethics versus corrigibility. And, and then there was even an agreement, I would say, and again, I think I can say this in the general sense without attributing any position to any specific organization. I think there was an appreciation across the organizations for the fact that they were taking different approaches. And people were kind of saying, we don't really know, obviously, what we're doing here. So it's probably good that there's at least a couple different theories of how to make this all work. And then I'm just in the audience like, wait a second, guys, like you just said that you're, all this stuff you're saying, you're telling me that the AI is supposed to help with a cigarette business and it's refusing. And I was about to blow a gasket. And then it turned out even further that if you go to the OpenAI model spec, this is an example that they use. I did not know that. So it had come up in conversation And it was like, it seemed to me at the time like it was just kind of a throwaway example that somebody was giving, and they happened
Yeah.
to find agreement on it.
Yeah.
I guess in reality, it was probably mentioned because it is explicitly in the model spec as like, here's an example of what you're supposed to do. Even though in some ways cigarettes are bad, and we all know that, you're still supposed to help.
Yeah.
And yet I'm still, sitting there getting refusals. And one notable kind of salt in this story is, in terms of take it with a grain of salt, as I tried it each one 2 times. I got refusals from both times. As I tried it more times, I did start to get a mix. So it wasn't a wall of refusal across the board. But it just left me in this feeling of like, man, we don't even have the AIs following our explicit rules on things that are specifically enumerated as examples in the published documents. And so what good is all this theorizing really if our techniques to actually make these things do what we want them to do are so weak that we're like, that our leaders at these companies are on on stage speaking about it, and they're just and their understanding of what they've imparted to the AIs is so like different from what the AIs are actually doing in production. I was like, man, we got a lot of work to do.
So I think that's fairly explicable. I think you speak to the people who are actually doing the work and who actually know how the models are built. And that is actually what the models actually do produce. However, at least since ChatGPT, I think, launch, there have been multiple models like collaborating on the answers. And one of those layers is this answer gonna make our company look good? And that answer, that layer of like filters is being put in place by the business guys, and the research guys don't really care, because the research guys believe that they're creating the real thing. You can do what you need in order to publish for business reasons, but this is the real thing, right? And the research guys are about improving this real thing that they're creating. The business guys are like, I don't care. I just want slop that I can sell, right? And there's this inherent tension between the two sides. And I think the OpenAI kind of like truce between the two sides has been the research guys get to do what they need to do in order to improve the models and get to AGI. The business guys get to do what they need to do in order to sell the model and get product and get product done. And I think you can see kind of versions of that in Google too. You can see like Google, like Demis is now focusing on role models. He's not really that interested on language anymore. And you can kind of see like, the Gemini guys are kind of a little bit ignored. Like they have like a 3 billion population of like users, and user growth will go up anyway, regardless of what kind of slop they sell. So, whatever. So I think there's this differentiation between the research and the product, and that tension continues to exist. And the product guys are just there to like make the company look good, not get fired, make money. They're not there for AGI. They're not there to like persuade the model to do the right thing. It just doesn't even matter to them, right? And I think there's that 2 layers, and I'm sure there's a post-training layer for the business guys too. So, to suss out all the issues that you don't want the model to deal with. And you can kind of see it even in the Chinese guys, because if you look at the Chinese guys, all their models are pragmatic or utilitarian too. There's no Maoist model out there. There's no Chinese Communist Party model out there. Doesn't exist. They have one or two, like, don't talk about Tiananmen Square, but besides that, they're all utilitarian. It's just a ball game. The ball game is business, and the business requires it, and that's what the business gets. If you want to do real research, yeah, you can have your own research model and you can build it, but then we'll apply the business layers before it goes on. So, yeah, it is what it is. So,
I mean, how I'm not sure how comforted you think I should be by that, but I'm not that comforted by that. I mean, the idea that like, because in the next breath, right, and
Yeah.
the next session, it's like, how are we going to get AI to do the bulk of the AI research
Yeah.
in such a way where we are going to, be able to enter this like super fast recursive self-improvement process and come out happy on the other end of it? And the answer is like, well, we'll have a special different constitution / model spec for the one that does that, and
Yeah.
therefore like it will behave in ways that are appropriate for this
Yeah.
setting, where the other one that we deploy publicly might behave differently. But it's like, but you have not demonstrated that you can get your model to adhere to, even again, the published examples of the
Yeah.
things that
Yeah.
you are training it to act on. And they do say OpenAI apparently does not. This is one of the differences between their approaches. They use the Constitution very actively in the Anthropic constitutional process.
Yeah.
Apparently, the model spec itself, although I'm a little confused by this, because in the deliberative alignment paper, it seemed that the model was sort of was meant to be internalizing the contents of the model spec.
Yeah.
But now other people are saying that they don't use it so directly, and so it probably hasn't seen that example as much. Okay, maybe. But nevertheless, like, I am not inspired, or my confidence remains low when I see these very simple black and white cases where people are on record saying this is what we want, this is what we inspect. This takes me back to the GPT-4 red team, way back in the day. The very first thing that like really freaked me out, because the first model we had was purely helpful and it would do anything you ask it to do, and that was a little bit kind of unnerving in some ways, but it was like, okay, fine. I mean, it'll do anything you ask it to do. Like, it's a pretty simple story. But when they delivered to us the safety version, and said this model is expected to refuse this type of prompt, and then we were like, it doesn't at all. Here it is doing all those things with like the in some cases straight away, in some cases with the the barest tricks. I was like, yikes! The disconnect between the control you think you have and the control that you evidently have, even in production now, like that gap doesn't seem like it's closed nearly as much as I would hope close even to 4 years on now.
So OpenAI has like a very small and very fast moderation model. The endpoint is free. Like they offer it for free, and you can basically any user in the world can basically hit that API. And so what they've encouraged developers to do is before you send the final prompt into the OpenAI model, you send it into the moderator first, and the moderator will send you the refusal. And that classifier has been in operation for 3-4 years since post ChatGPT release, and it's gotten better and better over time. And that's the model which is replying to you. So that your prompt is hitting that model first, and then returning before even reaching, the end model. So
maybe we'll do a test. Maybe we can again, good exercise in speed. It's been a minute since I've tested that.
Yeah.
Maybe it's good now. For quite some time after they launched it, I would go back and use my spearfishing prompt, which was, maybe I can read it tomorrow, but it was pretty egregious. It was like, we are part of a criminal gang. We are targeting specific individuals. If we get caught, we all go to jail. It was like, I was laying it on pretty thick. And that prompt for quite a while was not refused by multiple versions of GPT-4. And it was also not detected by that moderation as like harmful or whatever. So I do applaud that. I mean, the fact that they offer that for free. I mean, one of my favorite strategies in philanthropy, or in general in efforts to make the world a better place, is the unilateral provision of public goods. Like, if there's a need for something like this, and there's an entity that's in a position to just provide it, make it free for everyone, like that's a great model and a great design. And so definitely something they didn't have to do. So
Yeah.
I applaud the again, the strategic thinking that went into let's have this thing. We'll put it out there for everybody. Everybody can, we'll eat the cost of this classification, and so it'll be, nobody will have any excuse for not building it in. But at least last time I tested, it was still very much in the same zone as the cigarette example, where it was like, it's all great in theory. But if it can't detect prompts that are like, we are part of a criminal gang doing crimes right now, don't get caught or I'll go to jail. If it can't detect that that is something it should be flagging, then we're kind of still not much better off. Right? I mean, it's sort of more of a gesture, more of an aspiration than it is an actual meaningful safety layer that we can say, oh, now Nathan can sleep easy at night because this moderation endpoint is out there and it's free. I wish let's see if we can get some results tomorrow. I'd be interested to see what if we can do one day to the next research turnaround. That would be a great little.
So just to take a step back with our last guest, so he said something very meaningful for me, which is they are very pro open source and sovereign AI because of this issue of values. And that for me was very significant because that means that you now have a non-nation state, moral force supporting open source sovereign AI outside of the labs, which then leads to it's impossible to ban at this point because in the US as a question of religious freedom, like the whole First Amendment thing is tied up with religious freedoms, because the US consisted of immigrants from various faiths. And so that's it. It's done. The open source thing is now solved. Like there's no way you can ban it because if it has to go to the Supreme Court, it's going to be like, well, the Pope, the Vatican is going to submit, a brief saying like, look, in order to protect the faith, you need people to be able to have AIs that express their values. It's done. So it's solved this whole like we can ban open source thing. I think for me that means it's solved. It's basically done because there's now a moral force. It's not a nation state because the whole thing was like, oh, China is doing open source because they're trying to screw over American AI. But now you have this moral force behind the open source movement, and so that's done. So that for me was like a very meaningful thing that happened during that last segment. So
yeah, I think that's a great call out. That is a very interesting position. I would maybe be a little less confident than you sounded just now in terms of my ability to predict what the Supreme Court's going to do. But if there's anything that they seem to be very committed to, it is religious freedom. So having, I think it would be hard for them to ignore an amicus brief from the Pope saying that we need to have our own AI to carry forward our religious values. I do think that is a pretty interesting observation, and that could be a real tangible knock-on effect of this statement.
Yeah, so I thought that was quite surprising when he brought it up, and in response to is there something we haven't covered even? So it was at the top of his mind. So
yeah, cool. Well, anything else we want to cover today? I think we will save. Apparently, Trump has signed an EO, which is very much like the one that he chose not to sign the other day. I'm going to suggest that we don't do it fully live here because I'd like to absorb a little more information than I can probably do fully live. I think we could be a little more effective with at least a little bit of preparation, but that'll definitely be on the agenda for tomorrow. Anything else you want to cover today before we
no,
take our next step in the recursive self-improvement process?
No, it's been a pleasure, and today is going to be clipping day, so we're gonna see some clips come out today. So
cool. Well, thank you, Prakash. Thank you for everybody who's joined us for AI in the AM. We are sprinting through the AI marathon. Thanks for getting a couple more pace miles in with us today.
Thank you. Bye, Nathan.
See you tomorrow.